of course, there's a domestic context for foreign policy, right? There was always a domestic context. So there's the role of the media, which we've already highlighted, the huge role that the media has. The media is called the fourth branch of government, right? And I know you can imagine why, because people get their news from the media and are, inspired by what the media highlights for them. So one effect on the domestic context for making foreign policy is decreasing coverage of foreign news in the U.S. So not really, really being U.S. centered, which makes sense that it's highlighting what's happening in our country, but not so much in recognizing that we're like on one planet. So decreasing coverage in foreign news plays a factor in the U.S.'s response to policy, right? Including things like whether or not the country supports going to war or not, right? That's a pretty big thing. So decreasing coverage of foreign news, which I highlight here with a clip on the U.S. airstrike on Soleimani, is an Iranian general. The U.S. dropped a bomb on him and killed him, right? But we weren't in a war with Iran, right? It was a targeted assassination. Killed other people as well. And so whether or not something like that stays in the consciousness long for folks within the country, and how that, what are the means by which people keep focus on it? Okay. For example, we see after the killing of Soleimani, the assassination, there were mass protests in Iran, which I linked to you. Protests sweep Iran after U.S. assassination of top journal Qassem Suleimani, right? So the mass protest in Iran, like calling for a response, right? And also there were protests in the U.S. Anti-war protesters rally in Los Angeles after Iranian general killed in the U.S. airstrike. Right? There was a there were protests within the U.S. to not continue to escalate things further, right? Not to push things even further, acknowledging what had already happened and not to escalate further. So this highlights that example here, what we can see with these protests. All right. And of course, the role of citizens in public policy. Okay. There's a really huge role that citizens play in public policy. So while we don't vote on public policy directly, we do vote for elected officials who then develop and implement policy, right? We do expect that officials are going to present an approach to public policy that we see highlighted in the campaign season, right? We see what their positions on trade, their positions on conflict, their positions on other nations, right? So we see that highlighted throughout, okay? And we can influence policy through our voting and feedback to elected officials, right? And there are all kinds of ways that we provide feedback. One, of course, being, communication with officials about policy. One is people who show up in the streets to protest, for example. The example of folks who were trying to get the U.S. to not continue to exacerbate things or worsen things with Iran after the assassination of Soleimani, the general, right? So people were out in the streets. People were contacting their representatives. No war with Iran, right? So that's just one example where we see that people actually take part in trying to say something about U.S. policy, right? Whether that be considering folks along the border, right? All the folks who were, there's the stay in Mexico policy around asylum seekers, right? There were folks who, like, American citizens who, like, went to the border, or folks hearing about these immigrant children who were incarcerated. Folks showed up at these centers where these kids were being held, right? So there are all kinds of ways that people try to make their voices heard, contacting their representatives, protesting, or in selecting their representatives to begin with. knowing where they stand on foreign policy issues is important, right? Because remember the obvious point, right? We are one nation in a big world, right? And so it's not just about what's happening within the United States. It's about our relationship with the rest of the world, right? It's about our work to persevere as a planet, right? With evidence and the examples from this last week's lecture and this week's lecture on what the planet, what these governments are doing around climate change, right? This is an example of foreign policy. Are we going to rally together, right? Or not? Okay. Anyhow, that's a lot of food for thought. Please keep in mind that I'll post the videos for these different portions of the lecture in the description below. And we'll take it from there. Okay, good job, everybody.